All right, getting some good answers in. As an agreement, it's what Jonathan says at the Prince household. To build a relationship from mum and dad, sometimes to make others feel better from Steve. That's a reasonable thing to, yeah, because you can't trust people to do what they say they will do. And I guess you mean by that, Rob and Sharon, that maybe there's something you do as part of a promise, like shake on it or pinky promise, as is in the image below. Does anyone have anything out loud they want to say? I'll give you a little bit of clear air. Oh, I like Mina's answer. That's pretty good too.
A promise has intention behind it. Shows that somebody plans to do whatever it is they are promising.
Okay. Yep. Yep. That's I would agree. Okay. There's a bit of an incentive thing as well. Zach's saying that, and I saw Mina say something. Oh, yeah, wanting something in return. That's interesting as well, isn't it? Is it always a one-way? Is it always a two-way? Is it sometimes a one-way thing? I don't know. I don't have the answer for this question necessarily. It's as you can see, it can kind of go a few different places. All right, well, shelve that one for now.
Some people make.
Oh, yeah.
Some people make promises with no intention of carrying it out.
With yeah, and that's true. For anyone that has had a tradesman do any work for them, that's generally the way I feel sometimes. I hope we have no tradesmen on tonight. Is Caleb on tonight? Oh, no. No, but yes, sometimes people do overpromise and underdeliver, if you've heard of that. So yes, or not do it at all. Which is common in some cultures particularly. I don't know about New Zealand. I think we're pretty good here, but other cultures, I think promises are pretty meaningless. They are literally to appease people. Oh, Robert, sorry, the tradesman comment. My apologies. All right, let's go. Next question. The next one I have is, how important are promises in today's society? So, we're talking the value of them, and let's talk New Zealand society because that's what we're all most familiar with. I'll give you a minute to think about this. What is the actual importance of it? Do people hang their life on it, or are they pretty meaningless, and do we have other means? I'll give you a minute. All right, some of these answers are great. Everyone's kind of going towards the agreement side, like written ones in business, which is what Jonathan's saying. Buses. You want buses to promise things, otherwise you're going to get let down, and they do use them today, and they're pretty important. What else have we got? Packering, and they have to be signed and sealed to mean anything today in the world outside. Our promises should be different. That is very true, and Sophie was just saying whilst I was muted. That's essentially the reason we have written contracts and agreements now, is because a verbal promise isn't as meaningful as perhaps it was. As we had Brother Justin speak recently about the word and how important the word was. It basically created the world. God's word created, you know, didn't need anything else. It didn't need to sign a letter of intention or, yeah, anyway. Any other last thoughts? I think it does that. I think if you say you'll do something, that's a promise. If I will be there tomorrow at 8 a.m, that's a promise, isn't it? Kay's a bit burnt out from promises not happening, maybe. Just to get you all up to speed on the latest in music that the youth are into, there is a song at the moment which is all about a girl who's just got her driver's license. Has anyone heard that? Mina's probably our best bet at maybe having heard this song. Basically, and she goes on to say she's talking to her boyfriend in the song, and she has just got her license, and she's brokenhearted because this boyfriend had promised her they were going to do all these things when she had her license, and now they're not together. So in terms of relationships and young people and, you know, social groups, promises are kind of the binding force, aren't they, in terms of importance? Nanette saying that's a low intensity promise. What's a low intensity promise? Sorry, just to finish this question off. Saying you'll do something is a low intensity one. Okay. Nice. Okay, that's good. Hopefully you've kind of got your mind into promises now. We'll move on. But obviously we're going to look at the promises that God has made, and a couple of them. And there is a huge difference towards, you know, of what we've talked about tonight already with people versus the promises that God has given us. And so we're going to explore that a little bit further. So let's get into that. There are a number of promises, and these are kind of 4 of the main ones maybe that we'll find in the Bible. I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing to call it the promise in Eden, but I have heard it called that, so I went with it. We are going to briefly look at that one tonight. The promise with Noah. So we'll look at that one tonight in a lot more depth. Promises with Abraham, promises with David are 2 of the probably more well-known ones amongst our group. Should I say? I'm sure I'm right in saying that. And something that we kind of have as very much a nuts and bolts of why we get baptized and what we know God will do for us. So yes, but we're going to look at the first 2 mainly tonight. We can have discussion around how the other 2 work in perhaps, but let's go with the first one. Right, let's turn up Genesis 3:15. What Bible am I going to use? Message maybe. I'll go NIV. Right, I'll read this out just for the sake of not too much weirdness with waiting for someone to read it. So, but there will be opportunity to read soon. Oh, look at that, it's on the page anyway. Oh, thank you for, yes, the picture. The picture props, yes, I like it. Although I'm going to explain why it's not quite right, I reckon. Genesis 3:15, and setting the scene, I guess, just getting everyone up to speed. Eve has taken from the tree because a serpent has told her that this fruit would be good to eat and surely is fine to do, and basically spun these lies to her. And as a result, God is very frustrated because he's already told Eve not to do that. And here's the consequence of it in 3:15. And so this is God speaking, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Right. First couple of, Steve's already got in with a promise I haven't covered already. First little thing I thought I'd mention is obviously this is actually a promise, if we're calling it a promise, to the serpent. Yeah, so God is actually talking to the serpent, which is maybe a little bit odd, but he's basically not speaking to man. He's kind of explaining to the serpent who is a deceitful person who is lying and full of untruths, and he's giving the serpent this sort of promise. So that's interesting because we often associate the promises with man, but essentially God's kind of giving it back at creation, or this level of creation, or level of something that's part of the world that's not man. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. And then we have basically breaking it down. He's saying, I'll put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman. And so we have these two things that are now at war, which other translations use. They are now at war, these things, this untruthful serpent and this woman that has been deceived but was trying to do the right thing, perhaps. That's up for debate. Between your seed, serpent, and her seed. Right, so again, we've got these two groups. These two groups, oh, there's that weird arrow thing again. We have these two different seeds, and as the Bible sort of fleshes out this promise, as we see later on, we have a lot of references to kind of the viper and the seed of it in terms of untruthfulness. And a well-known one is, you brood of vipers, which is obviously Christ speaking to people who were literally doing kind of what the serpent was doing, in trying to cause people to sin, speaking untruths. So that is kind of where that seed sits. It's another great example of a serpent, is those Pharisees and Sadducees he was speaking to. I can pull up that verse for you if you like, but it is there. And then we have the seed of the woman. And perhaps after reading the second line of this verse, it's not necessarily particularly clear, but as we continue, it talks about, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. And again, without going too much into this promise, I guess we can decipher that this is speaking of Christ, and that this seed of the woman is actually talking about Christ, and that this woman seed person is always trying to resist doing the wrong thing, trying to resist untruths and more follow after God. We know Christ was born of a woman, and yes, so again we have this this sort of war between the two. The last line of this obviously talks about, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. And again, we have this weird sort of change in language in the verse, and it's talking about he all of a sudden. Who's this he? And as I've just mentioned, it is actually talking about Christ, we believe, and that Christ will bruise the head of the serpent that represents untruth, that represents deceitfulness, and things that are against God. But as a consequence of that trying to bruise, or that heel coming down on that untruthful thing, then there's a bruising against the heel as well. Now I'll throw this question out here because we discussed this a little bit this afternoon in my household of two. The bruising of the head is it sounds kind of painful. The bruising of the heel probably not as painful, or potentially not as fatal. Are both of these these bruisings fatal? That is my question for you. I'll give you a quick 30 seconds. I'm not sure where this is going to go, so let's see how you go. Is this bruising on both sides a fatal bruising? By the way, these are actually the same word in the Hebrew. Some translations have, he shall bruise your head and you shall strike his heel. I don't know why they've changed it to strike, but it's the same word in the Hebrew. So the thought of that picture biting the heel, I don't think is actually accurate. I think it's just a bruise from the impact.
Very simplistic to talk about, is it fatal? I mean, Christ completely overcame sin, so you could say, therefore, he struck a fatal blow to sin. And he was crucified, so therefore you could say he died. And in a sense, we would think of that as fatal, but as he was resurrected, it wasn't fatal.
Very good. Yes. Ooh, Mina's got a nice little thread of thought there. I like that. Christ had the antidote. The head being crushed sounds fairly fatal. Yeah, I think it possibly is, but I think there is the idea that the crushing is still kind of going on in our lives. I know it's Christ that obviously is speaking of here. Yeah, but I think you're probably right. I think the crush to the snake is fatal, but obviously we know perhaps if we could say that the damage or the bruising to the foot, which is Christ, was temporary. It was 3 days, for sake of accurate numbers. So yes,
A snake bite doesn't have to end in death. But
no.
if you squash a snake's head flat, it will.
Correct. And as I say, I mean, the snake bite is interestingly not maybe accurately translated. It should just be bruise in the sense of a collision of heel to snake bony head. Just because I don't know why I'm just not sure why they translated it to strike in some other translations, but I mean, maybe it doesn't necessarily change the meaning of it anyway. Excellent, Mina.
Yeah, the
Yes,
poisoning.
snake. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
The poisoning can be dealt with. It doesn't have to end in fatality. If you don't deal with it, it will.
True. Yes. Okay. That's great. Thank you for that. As I say, I just wanted to kind of touch on this one and just sort of set the scene for the whole Bible, essentially, with this one, and that this really opens up the word for us in terms of the freedom that we can have, and that the sin has been crushed for us. And whether that's completely crushed or we're participating in that crushing still, up to maybe some interpretation still. But yes, I'm going to read down Josie's. I feel the intent of the heel is the main action here. The heel is out to destroy and cause serious harm. The snake just happens to get a little nip in before he dies. Yeah, that is the intent of, yeah, I like it. Alrighty, let's crack on. As I say, I kind of spent a bit of time on that one, but what I really got stuck into, if I'm honest, is the promise to Noah, and went some wacky places. So let's explore that a little bit more. Noah is obviously only a few more chapters over, so let's flick over to kind of chapter 7-ish. And we're going to start by looking at the story of Noah, because you may know that the covenant comes in chapter 9 of Genesis, but in exploring this covenant, you actually need to kind of explore the whole story to work out what's being promised, what this covenant is about. So what I'm going to do is read out a few verses of the story, which may sort of not all connect in terms of fleshing out the full story. I'm sure a lot of us know it. Noah, ark, flood dissipates, happy days, animals, salvation. There you go. But let's look at some sort of verses which I think are interesting to pull out. Let's look at Genesis 7 and verse 4. I'll just read these out. I feel like the whole waiting for someone to say something is awkward. So let's go. Genesis 7 and verse 4. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. All right, so here's God, and with his statement around the fact that there will be a complete destruction of the earth with a flood, with rain, and it will be in 7 days' time. And in verse 10, and after the 7 days, the flood waters came on the earth. Great, there's a little mini promise in there. Wasn't really intending that to be one, but there you go. Let's look at the next verse there on screen, Genesis 7, verse 17. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. So we're just skimming through and kind of pulling out some interesting detail And what's interesting for me in this is the number 40. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, raining, and also waters coming up from the deep, from both directions. Next verse to look at, Genesis 7 and 23 and 24. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Men and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds of the air were wiped out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. So here we have a kind of sequence of verses which actually just tell the story almost without giving us too much detail, but we've kind of got what happened. God said there'd be a flood, it rained for 40 days, and then the waters were on the earth for 150 days, and everything ceased to exist except for Noah. Let's keep going. Genesis 8, verse 3. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. Right, so we have the waters going down, which is great. Skipping through to verse 6. After 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the ark. Okay, so now we are getting to the point that he's checking on what's going on in the world. And in verse 10, he waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. So he's been sending out birds at this point. And then in verse 12, he waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return to him. Right. What we have here is an interesting little pattern of numbers. Now, I'm not sure who heard my exhort 3 or 4 weeks ago, but I've kind of been getting stuck into some of this sort of more interesting backstory, I guess, of what's going on in some of these early Genesis stories. And certainly the way that the Bible is written for us, and particularly these first sort of 12 chapters, is extremely interesting in terms of how it's all laid out. And here's a little example of that. We have this 7, 40, 150, 150, 40, 7 and 7. Some people would say that the first 7 is in verse 4 and 10, therefore it makes 2 7s like at the end. But we have this basically a little peak of numbers and then a little dip of numbers back exactly the same pattern. Here's a big word for people, chiasm. Maybe some of you have heard of it, maybe some of you haven't. If you're new to the idea, a chiasm is basically what you're looking at, where you have this kind of pattern of things, words, numbers, phrases, whatever it might be, and then it might go the other direction as well. And there's often a middle, and there's often a start and an end. And this one's reasonably easy to pick out. It's the record kind of just sort of delivers it up. So this is a bit of as I say, the word is chiasm, or it's a chiastic bit of literacy in the Bible. Now, what's interesting about these is they kind of deliver a bit more information in a few different ways. They deliver information by looking at what is the actual middle verse. Then, if you imagine this mountain peak like it is on the side, a peak going up, and then there's something at the top, and then you're coming back down. People sort of look at that middle verse or that middle phrase that might indicate some greater meaning or understanding of the scripture. This is just a very brief look at this chiasm. The larger look is like this. So some people have decided that it actually goes this far and deep. And it starts right back in chapter 6, verse 9, talking about Noah, the righteous man, and ends right at the bottom of the page with Noah is now dead. So introduced, and then he's dead. And then his sons are mentioned, and that kind of bookends that part. And then the earth is full of corruption and violence. That's actually repeated again somewhere else, which is interesting within the text there. And then you can see sort of in the middle there, you've got your 7 and your 40 and your 150 and your 150 and your 7 and 40, blah, 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 and a whole lot of other stuff that people think kind of fits in between. As I mentioned before, what makes chiasms interesting is the middle verse or the middle potential phrase. What is the middle verse here? Let's get someone to read. Can I get someone on, please, to read chapter 8 and verse 1? We're in the middle of the flood at this point.
I can read that if you like, Josh.
Thank you, Ruth. Go for it.
And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Maybe, is there much in that verse? God remembered Noah. Well, to be fair, it's a bit strange. As I read some commentary about this, it's as if God had sort of ducked out to do something else, and while the earth's being flooded, and then at the 150-day mark or somewhere around there, he's like, oh, Noah's there. Completely forgotten. Now I've remembered. Oh, God's yeah. Whoops. So it's kind of a strange phrase, I guess, that God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock. Okay, that's a little introduction to chiasms. We are going to do one or two more in this session, so let's keep going. Here's not necessarily a chiasm, I guess, but more of a repeat maybe of something that has already happened in Scripture. And what is an interesting thing to look at is the story of creation just a few chapters earlier and the story we have in front of us now. So this is actually going to be a bit of an activity for you all. Well, the first thing to actually note is this has worked in well with Darren's talk last week, because if you all heard Ruth read that God sent a wind over the earth. This is exactly what Darren was talking about last week. And that's a little clue as to where this creation story might start. So what I might do is I'll give you maybe more like 2 or 3 minutes to look through the verses of chapter 8 and see what creation features come out. And then I will divulge what I think they could be in those verses in chapter 8. So go for it. So just to repeat, you're looking for the days of creation in the, let's just give you the first chunk of chapter 8. All right, we're getting some answers. Excellent. Okay, I'll take you through what I've found with some help from some different resources, but this kind of just starts to fill in the picture of the story of Noah and leads us into the covenant. So it's a pretty cool exercise. Let's move that out of the way. Oh, that didn't move far enough. Oh, genuinely. Okay, hang on. I'll be back in a second. The problem is that it's not gonna, it's gonna cover over. There we go. Let's go from current slides. All right. Oh no, hang on. Sorry, technical difficulties. All right. Oh, you saw all the answers there, but we'll go through them one by one. Come on, there we are. Okay, so as many people already found, day one we have, and if you're flipping back to Genesis 1, obviously, this one's a little bit maybe debatable. Sometimes I just wonder if everyone necessarily agrees that God hovering over the waters, that the Spirit of God hovering over the waters was actually day one. But it is immediately, you know, the next verse is, and God said, let there be light. So I think maybe it's day one. But yes, so there we have day one of creation. I saw, and then also interesting, and I don't know, it's out of order, so it doesn't really work, but I have heard it explained that that Noah opened the window in verse 6, and this is chapter 8, obviously, and that was the light coming in. Don't know about that. Not necessarily, that's why it's in grey. Day two. Thank you, Robert. You found that one pretty quickly. Now, the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain stopped falling from the sky. This is actually pretty awesome because it actually kind of almost gives it more detail to perhaps how creation worked with the water, with the expanse being drawn up and the sea being created. So I thought that was kind of interesting for an explanation of day two. Day three, we have in verse 4 and 5, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month. On the first day of the 10th month, on the tops of the mountains became visible. Dry land, fantastic. We have dry land appearing. Day 4, we have, who knows what day 4 is? I've taken that picture out, so no one can actually be trying to keep up with what is day 4. So day 4 we have verse 7 and 8.
Moon and stars.
Is that day 4, or is that or have I got birds around the wrong way?
Day 4.
Oh, okay, I've got this around the wrong way. Okay, this is obviously day 5 then that I'm looking at. We're going to look at day 4, sun, moon, stars day. So we have the birds coming out of the ark. So we now have bird life entering into the world. There we go. So flip day 5 and 4 around, sorry. I've got the explanation of that for the sun, moon, and stars is that they weren't actually destroyed as part of this creation. They weren't the thing that was evil. They weren't the thing that God needed to correct. I don't know. This is a little not necessarily my own content. I just kind of playing around with the idea. So there is no sun, moon, stars recreation, is what I'm saying. And then the next one, we have day 6, and that's, I don't need to read all of those verses, but as you will know from the story of from verse 14, by the 27th day of the 2nd month, the earth was completely dry. God said to Noah, come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, their wives, bring every kind of living creature that is with you. And so everything else comes out as well. So that's quite, that's kind of interesting. It's, as I say, it's maybe not perfect. And again, for those that remember my excerpt from about a month ago, the imperfectness of things isn't necessarily bad. And if you are a Jewish person, you would get excited by the fact that this isn't perfect, because maybe the sun, moon, and stars is somewhere in there and just needs to be worked out. So that might be something that becomes evident in the future. Who knows?
Josh, can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
What about if we talk about the symbolic sun, moon, and stars, which were the ruling powers before the flood? They were all destroyed, and Noah would have been the one who was then in charge of the earth after the flood.
Yeah, that's yeah, I did think that, the whole powers and principalities and yeah, interesting.
Thought anyway.
That, or I guess the idea of, you know, we're pretty comfortable with the idea that that Christ was very much in God's mind as the way that this world would be saved from sin and death, as we already have in a previous promise that we've already looked at tonight. And that sort of, you know, power of salvation was still very much intact. Anyway, there's different ways to look at it. And yeah, just thought that was interesting to kind of flesh out the story a little bit more before we've even looked at the covenant. Now, this raises an interesting question. Where is our Sabbath day in this? And I would maybe argue, that it's in verse 21 of chapter 8. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. So that seems to be the sort of end moment of kind of like the Sabbath was a moment where God rested. And for anyone that has an understanding of God, God didn't need to rest. God didn't get tired. God didn't kind of run out of things to do. He didn't need a nap. God rested because he had finished creating. He had finished his work. He had finished his artwork, essentially. And you can liken it to someone making a sculpture or painting and Reese will remember this from our flat warming years and years ago, where we were painting this big canvas and we were painting it. I remember halfway through the evening it looking amazing and all this picture, all this imagery was coming together. And then a couple of hours went on and a few other people contributed and it just went to muck. It really did. And that's because we kept creating. And the idea of Sabbath, you can say, is that God stopped creating. And what we see here is that God has stopped destroying. This is God's Sabbath moment of, I have finished destroying and I will never destroy again. And he's saying it within his heart at this point. So this is basically the summary of what the covenant's going to be when he says it to Noah shortly. What I also just kind of struck me this afternoon about this verse, for those that are pretty familiar with the creation story, it's a funny sort of situation where God basically says the covenant here and then kind of goes backwards and then starts talking to Noah, which is sort of what the creation story does. It gets to, in chapter 2, verse 2, the seventh day, God has finished his work and he rested and from all the work that he had done. And then it goes back into verse 5 and 6, and that he formed God, man out of the dust of the ground, but he's already formed man back there. It just has this weird familiarity of that sort of structure of how it kind of gives you the information, and then it kind of goes back and fleshes it out more. I don't know if you're comfortable with that. Sophie's not shaking her head either way. So yes, all right, let's keep going anyway. All right, this is the colouring in pencils moment. How are we going for time? Oh yeah, good. This is the covenant with Noah and the earth. I've said the earth because let's read this together. It is with all of the earth. So you read in your Bible if you like, but this is in Genesis chapter 9 and from verse 9 to 17. Where am I? I now establish my covenant. Oh, let's read from verse 8. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I will establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow, bad translation, bow, in the clouds. and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenants between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the bow appears in the clouds, I'll see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all the living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I've established between me and all life on the earth. I don't know what strikes you about this covenant, and that's the end of God sort of speaking, and then we have, you know, a little bit of a story about Noah and his sons. I don't know what strikes you about this, but it's kind of repetitive. There's some phrases which are more or less the same that come out a number of times, which is cue for colouring in pencils. And when you see things like this, it isn't done for, I don't know, for no reason. There can be more to this than it just being repetitive for the sake of nothing. So let's have a look at some of the repetitions. Silly thing. There we go. Right, the word covenant. I mean, this is about a covenant, so it should have the word in there a lot of times. How many times? 7. The word covenant is in there 7 times. If you want to colour these in, these will be up for the next sort of 5 minutes, but I'm going to be overlaying a few other colours. The word earth comes up also 7 times, which again makes sense. That's what this is all about, the covenant with the earth, with every beast of the field and all that, which is interesting. The word bow, which by the way, it's not, they didn't have a word for rainbow back then, so I think the word bow is better because it might open up a few other scenarios where what this bow could be. So that's 3 times. We have the word cloud, which is interesting because we don't often talk about the cloud as part of the bow in terms of the promise, but it's very much there, and it's there 4 times. It's actually there 5 times, which is annoying, but apparently I'm not even sure where the 5th one is. A rabbi told me that. Oh wow, I read a thing from a rabbi. Apparently the word cloud in the Hebrew is there a 5th time. Couldn't tell you where, sorry. And then the last one there is that sort of phrase there, which comes out another 5 times. With your seed after you and with every living creature, between me, you and the creature, between me and you and every living creature, God and living. That was the bit that started to, you might have felt, kind of got quite repetitive with this little passage. So with all that said and done, and I've done this in my Bible, and it looks kind of cool, but it kind of creates maybe another chiasm, back to that old word. So what we have is a bunch, we've got 7 covenants, 7 earths, 3 bows, 5 clouds, again, sorry, I don't know where the 5th one is, and 5 of that phrase around every living creature of flesh, or not necessarily of flesh, but every living creature. So we've kind of got 2 7s, 2 5s, and a 3. Now, the thing with a chiasm is you're looking for a center, and Zach, can I get what do you prefer, odd numbers or even numbers?
My heart prefers even for sure.
Wow, okay, that's fine. Ignore Zach, because what's lame about even numbers is when you're trying to find the middle of an even number, you can't use a whole number. However, when you're trying to find the middle of an odd number, we get a middle. And when we're looking at chiasms, you changed your mind? Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the middle of 7 is obviously 1, 2, 3, 7, 5, 6 is 4. Middle of 5, 1, 2, 5, 4 is 3. Middle of 3 is 2. What this is pointing to, and I don't have the answers for all of this, but it is potentially pointing to something in this covenant from God to some sort of center. And it is somewhere in here, because we kind of have obviously a balance of stuff before and after. And yes, I've heard where it's said it is, Would anyone try to hazard a guess as to where they think it could be, the center of the 7, 5, and 3 of these words? You can basically, I mean, it's not easy because they don't kind of line up like you should imagine they should, but you're essentially trying to potentially take the middle word of each one. So if we're looking at, yeah, it's not easy. Earth is sort of
Verse
nicely
14.
easy. Sorry?
Verse 14.
Verse 14, it is somewhere around verse 14 and 15. Obviously, the verses weren't, constructed by God. He didn't sort of dictate with verse numbers. Sophia's maybe onto it. I think it might be somewhere around the beginning of verse 15. Well, that's what I've also kind of, full disclosure, been reading about, that it's about this high, again, I will remember my covenant, which again is a beautiful little hark back to the beginning of verse 8, chapter 8, where we had the fact that God remembered Noah. So in and amongst all of the story, we have all of these amazing little patterns potentially going on. I'm not gonna pin my hopes and dreams to this being exactly true, but there's something to it when there is a lot of sort of repetition and stuff, colors sort of align in this way. But anyway,
just
basically
a little
what I'm trying to explain.
suggestion, Josh, on
Yes.
the word token there. Very interesting word right in the middle of verse 13, where the cloud is
yes.
set for a token. So 77 times it appears in the Bible, and it is like a key verse for God's sign that he's going to give to man. So
Interesting. Nice. Okay. So yeah, maybe there's a bit around. Yeah. So yeah, in summary,
also in verse 12.
Sorry.
Also in verse 12.
Oh, token is it just there twice? I don't see it anywhere else. Yeah. Interesting. We are going to look at that to close very shortly, actually, the whole idea of this sort of token or sign. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. I found this interesting in terms of it just sort of bringing out a new meaning, particularly when we're looking at God remembered in verse chapter 8, which seems to be this new creation that's been created of the world. Earth 2.0 essentially has been created at the beginning of chapter 8, and then we had this chiasm that seems to maybe be pointing towards God remembering his covenant. To close, let's look at an idea of a covenant, which in old words, there's a thing called a suzerain and a vassal covenant. I'm not sure who's heard of this. A suzerain and a vassal is essentially got a god. I'm saying a god because this is quite an old term to represent everything from old Greek gods to Mesopotamian gods to all sorts of gods that were believed in back in those days. And so a suzerain was that sort of higher power, that one that kind of held the cards essentially of power, and a vassal who was the human on earth. And so it's in these times, and again, this harking back to me around Abraham coming from Mesopotamia and having known about all these other gods. These kind of covenants with a god was a known thing. Now, what would often happen with a suzerain and a vassal covenant is that the vassal was the one that was required to keep a copy of the covenant. If we read this little phrase below, I've kind of got it half covered. The suzerain would keep one copy of the covenant and the vassal would keep one copy of the covenant. This can be seen with the giving of the Torah, and the reason there were 2 tablets. Typically, the most widely used rite was that of the cutting of bodies of animals in halves and placing them in 2 rows with enough space for the 2 parties of the treaty to walk side by side, as with the Abrahamic covenant. And again, it's not a promise we've looked at, but obviously Abraham in a few chapters' time splits some animals in the dove and the pigeon. Anyway, But what's interesting about this is that God wasn't relying on the vassal, being Noah, to remember this covenant. I can't go backwards. Oh, that's right. He'd given them the token, and he had said, I will be the one that remembers this. You don't need to remember Noah. It will be me. And so I guess when you put it in the perspective of the suzerain and vassal covenant, which was the normal way things were done, and if anything, I think the vassal was more responsible for upholding the covenant and reminding the suzerain, no, you can't kill me because, or whatever it could be. In this case, God is saying, I will be the one that will remember for you. A very different approach for a God, and something that I guess indeed the God we know is the only true God to the people of Israel. Right. That's actually it. I feel like I've kind of just ended in a pretty awkward spot. But I guess as we kind of close, I wanted to spend more time on this covenant because to unpack all of that story is interesting, and it gives new meaning to God actually being the one that remembers the covenant, whereas a lot of the other times people were the man was the one that needed to be remembering it. Yeah, that's kind of it.
Josh,
Sorry,
just a quick comment on the remembering. It's not as though God has forgotten it, because we get a similar passage in Psalm 103 where it says that God remembers that we are dust. And it's something that's in his mind all the time. And that's why he doesn't come down on us and blot us out when we make one mistake. So it's there all the time, but he just brings it out from time to time and awakens our mind to the fact that he's always there watching and knowing. And yeah, that's the way I see it.
Yep. And again, again, when you look into this ancient history of gods and man, it's that remembrance was unique. So that's important to remember.
Book of Remembrance.
That's right.
Yeah, any other questions or comments? Had you seen those chiasms before? Do you like it? Do you not like it? That's also fine.
How do you spell that?
Oh, great question. C-H, oh, nah, hang on. I have
I-A-S-M.
Yes, it's kind of chiasm.
Yeah.
C-H-I-A-S-M.
I think.
Yeah, that's correct. So there's a lot of other literature on these. If you want to get stuck in, you have a lifelong endeavor to kind of search them out. I know one of the more known ones, perhaps in Christadelphian material, is Brother John Popel's work on Song of Solomon. He does it in Song of Solomon. Yeah.
Would it have been easier in the Hebrew? Is it more likely to work in the Hebrew?
Yes and no, I guess. Yeah, I mean, as you saw, I've got a missing word there. Reese has given an attempt at spelling. I don't know if that's true or not. Yeah, a little bit, but obviously we can pick up ones to some extent. I mean, like when things start to get repetitive, I don't think we should not question it and assume that, you know, the writer had very short-term memory loss. There might be a bit more to it.